You and I know he ordered a wife like winter flower, pure necessity. Expected nothing but a sturdy sack that wouldn't tear. Jed just wanted a cook, a mender. A warm body to keep that killing frost out of his damn marrow. He expected silence. Hoped for cold, practical obedience. Instead, he got a woman smelling of black powder and crushed sage, packing a stare sharp enough to flay a man alive. She didn't just thaw his frozen life. She burned it flat to the ground. That straight razor scraped Jed's jaw, sounding exactly like a rusty shovel hitting rough gravel. He paused, wiping cheap lye soap and his own blood onto a rag, reeking faintly of old bear grease. His hands, calloused, thick as cured saddle leather, were dead useless for the delicate chore of making himself look decent. He nicked his chin again. Cussed hard, dropping the blade into the tin basin with a loud clatter. Presentable. The words sat like a burr in his boot. Jed glared into a cracked mirror nailed to the wall. He looked exactly like what he was. A fellow who spent the last 7 years talking more to mules and trapped pelts than people. Hair like wet bark, skin weathered deep. Permanent lines carved around his eyes from squinting into the high country sun. He yanked the collar of a stiff cotton shirt bought 3 years back and worn exactly twice. Felt like a hangman's rope. He didn't want to ride down that mountain. Didn't want a wife. But the winter of '82 nearly did him in. A busted leg, a fire that refused to catch, and 3 days of fever, dragging himself across the dirt just to eat snow. He needed insurance against the brutal isolation. Needed somebody to boil water and keep the hearth lit when he crawled in bleeding. So he sent a letter, $50, and a blunt description of his life to a St. Louis marriage agency. I live high up. It is cold. Work is hard. If you fear the dark, do not come. He hitched his team. Jasper and Clementine, his mules, blew thick white steam into the freezing morning air. The harness leather was stiff with frost, stinking of neat's foot oil and stale sweat. Jed climbed aboard frozen wood biting right through his wool trousers and snapped the reins. The ride down to Copper Creek took 4 hours. Now stick with me. The high timber silence slowly yielded to the irritating racket of civilization. A blacksmith's distant hammer ringing, a mangy hound barking, and men hollering over unloaded freight. Jed hated it right off. Down here, the air smelled wrong, choked with coal smoke, horse manure, and unwashed bodies crowded close. The stagecoach already sat at the depot. Tying off the mules, Jed stood by the boardwalk, hunching his massive shoulders against a bitter wind. He felt completely out of place. Watched the folks step down. A bowler hat salesman, a coughing prospector, and then her name. Going by the lone letter he got back was Adeline. She looked nothing like those fancy agency catalog drawings. No rosy cheeks, no delicate lace framing a shy smile. Adeline stepped from that carriage with a heavy, ungraceful thud. She wore a drab brown wool coat past its prime, and a hat pinned mercilessly to hair colored like rusted iron. She looked dog-tired, pale under trail dust, but her posture stayed rigid. Jed walked up, boots hitting the boards with heavy, deliberate thuds. He stopped 3 feet away. Her scent hit him. No fancy rosewater, just sharp lye soap, old paper, and the bitter dust of a 1,000-mile trail. "You are Adeline?" he asked, voice like gravel, unused to talking. She didn't flinch at his tone. She turned her head. He felt the sheer impact of her gaze, pale, washed-out gray like the sky right before a winter blizzard breaks. Those eyes held absolutely no illusion, no sweet romance, and zero fear. "I am," she said, her voice raspy like dry corn husks. "You are Jed. You look exactly as unpleasant as your letter suggested." A strange jolt struck Jed right in the chest. He didn't know what he expected. Tears, maybe? Some fright at his massive size? You and I can guess he didn't expect to be sized up and called out so damn bluntly. "Gather round." A sudden blind anger washed over him. "Trunk," he gave a low grunt, pointing up at the stagecoach. That green one with the busted brass latch. No hand offered to help her down. No polite frontier greetings either. He walked right past her, yanking that battered old chest down with a heavy grunt. Thing weighed a whole lot more than it looked, probably full of books. He dragged it over and tossed it into the wagon bed. Turning back, he saw her waiting stiffly by the wagon wheel. "It is a 4-hour ride," he muttered, climbing up, without even sparing her a glance. "It is going to freeze." Adeline grabbed the wagon bed knuckles, bone white, and pulled herself right up onto that hard seat beside him. She never waited for a handout. She settled on the rough wood, pulling that thin coat tight around her neck. "Then I suggest you stop talking and drive these mules." She spoke while staring dead at the mountain peaks. Jed clamped his jaw shut. He snapped the reins across those mules with a whole lot of extra meanness. The buckboard lurched ahead. He just wanted a quiet, obedient shadow to keep his cabin warm and cook his grub. "Look close with me now." Staring at her stiff, dusty profile, Jed knew with a sinking gut he had imported a storm. The trail up was brutal. It dropped 10 degrees every hour they climbed. Valley mud turned to ruts, frozen hard as iron horseshoes. The wooden wheels slammed the earth, sending a mean rattle straight up Jed's tired spine. He shot Adeline a sideways glance. She had been dead silent for 2 hours. Her lips were completely drained of blood, turning a sickly blue. She was shaking, not in dainty little shivers, but in harsh, heavy spasms rocking her whole body. Still, her jaw stayed clamped shut tight. Her eyes drilled into that dark wall of pine trees ahead. A strange, bitter prickle of guilt started crawling up the back of Jed's neck. He muttered a dark curse, reaching behind the wooden seat with one hand, and dragged out a massive, raw buffalo robe. That hide reeked of trail dirt, old blood, and wild animal musk. He tossed it hard across her freezing lap. "Pull that over your head." Adeline flinched hard when that heavy hide hit her, her nose wrinkling up at the sharp, foul stench. For a brief second, he figured her stubborn pride might make her refuse it, but survival always wins the West. She yanked the fur up to her chin, hiding her stiff, frozen hands deep inside the woolly mess. "Thank you." She barely managed to whisper through loudly chattering teeth. "Do not thank me," he snapped, locking his eyes on the mean road. "If you freeze to death before we arrive, I am out $50. It was a downright cruel thing to say. He knew it the exact second those harsh words left his mouth. Just a shield, a dusty cowboy trick, to keep a mile of distance between them. He waited for tears or a sharp slap back. Instead, she let out a sound that made the hairs on his cold arms stand straight up. She laughed. A short, hollow sound with absolutely zero joy in it, but a true laugh all the same. "Practical." She muttered softly into the buffalo fur. "I can work with practical." They hit the clearing right as the sun hid behind the jagged peaks, dumping the whole valley into a bruised, bitter twilight. Jed's cabin sat squat and ugly against the dark timber built out of massive, rough logs. No pretty curtains, no flower boxes. It was a rough timber fortress against the wild. And nothing else. Jed jumped down that old bad leg of his, screaming from the biting cold. He tied off the dusty mules and started unhitching. He figured Adeline would sit tight for a hand down. He truly expected her to wait on an invitation inside. Dead wrong again. By the time he penned the mules in the lean-to and walked back to fetch that trunk, her boots were already planted in the dirt. She stood up on the tiny, warped porch boards, shoving that heavy oak door wide open. Jed hoisted the trunk onto his tired shoulder and followed her right inside. The cabin was bone-chilling, the air dead still. It smelled strongly of stale wood ash, unwashed wool, and old bacon grease. In those dim shadows, the total mess of his lonely frontiersman life was laid bare. Rusted traps hung down from the rafters. A messy heap of bloody, half-scraped beaver pelts owned the far corner. The table was buried in dirty tin plates and a rusted Winchester rifle. He dropped that trunk hard. You and I know he suddenly felt all that awful squalor. Jed felt a hot flush of shame buried real quick under a thick hide of defensive anger. Let her see it, he figured. Let her see exactly what she signed up for. Meanwhile, Adeline stood dead center in that room. She didn't drop her heavy bag. She sure didn't take off her hat. She turned in a slow circle, those gray eyes taking in every speck of blood, dirt, and rust. Over at the stone hearth, Jed struck a match to the kindling he had laid out that morning. "It ain't a mansion," he grumbled to her back, his voice rough as sandpaper. "I told you this life was hard." "You never mentioned it was a slaughterhouse," she fired back. Jed stood up tall while the flames caught the dry pine with a sharp crackle. He turned around, towering over her by a whole foot, letting his sheer size do the intimidating. "I catch things, and I skin them. That pays for our flour and coffee. If you got a weak stomach, that wagon is still waiting outside." Adeline finally turned to look him dead in the eye. The firelight flickered across her pale face, catching the sharp angles of her cheekbones and those dark, exhausted circles under her eyes. But she didn't back down from his towering height. She didn't cower from his foul temper either. She just set her little travel bag on the only clean chair in the whole room. She unpinned her hat, set it aside, and calmly unbuttoned her drab coat. "My stomach is just fine, Jed," she said, nice and even. She walked right past him, trailing a sharp, soapy scent, and stopped squarely at his cluttered table. She grabbed those dirty tin plates, stacking them up with a loud, ringing clatter. "But if I'm cooking your meals, you are moving those rotting pelts out of my kitchen." Now Jed just stared at her, genuinely thrown off balance. His chest went tight. A weird mix of pure outrage and something totally unnameable pulling at his ribs. Listen, he was the law up here. He was the mountain itself. They need to cure, he argued, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "They can cure out in the shed." Adeline countered right back, grabbing his heavy Winchester and holding it out. "And guns do not belong on a dining table. Take it." He looked down at the rifle in her hands. Then he looked at the hard, uncompromising set of her jaw. "Let me tell you, for a long, tense minute, the only sound was that snapping fire and the wind howling against the logs outside." Slowly feeling like an absolute fool, Jed reached right out and took the rifle. Adeline nodded, just once, all business. "Good. Now where is the bucket? If I am cleaning this floor, I need hot water." Jed stood frozen by the hearth, watching her tie an apron over her dusty dress. He had paid for a servant to make frontier life easier, but as she started violently scrubbing the grease off his table, he realized he had invited a massive disruptive force right into his sanctuary. The absolute dead silence of his mountain life was gone, and as he watched the warm firelight catch those rust-red strands of her hair, you and I know how proud mountain men are. But a terrifying thought hit him. He wasn't sure he wanted the silence back. Jed woke to a foreign sound. It was the rhythmic metallic scrape of a heavy iron skillet dragging across the stovetop. He lay stiff on that pallet of cured bear skins he had dragged by the hearth, staring straight up at the soot-stained rafters. For 7 long years, the very first sounds of his morning had been the wind rattling his ill-fitting door, the restless mules stamping out in the lean-to, and the popping of his own stiff joints. Now there was the sharp hiss of water hitting hot grease. He threw back the heavy wool blanket, the icy mountain air biting right through his long johns. He dragged a rough hand down his face, feeling the harsh stubble he had flat missed with the razor yesterday. The whole cabin smelled completely foreign. That sharp, nasty stench of old blood and damp fur was gone, swapped for the rich scent of chicory coffee, burning pine, and frying salt pork. Jed stood up, pulling on his heavy trousers and cold boots in grim silence. He didn't even glance toward the kitchen corner until he was fully dressed. Adeline was already wearing her work apron. Her rust-colored hair was yanked back into a severe, practical knot, though a few wild strands had escaped to stick to her damp forehead. She was working that massive cast-iron stove with the frantic, jerky motions of an Easterner entirely unaccustomed to its temperamental drafts. The heat in that little cabin was already stifling, a mighty stark contrast to the freezing temperatures waiting outside. "You are burning the meat." Jed rasped his gravelly voice, thick with sleep and clear irritation. Well, Adeline jumped her tense shoulders, snapping right up toward her ears. "Now gather round and picture this." She spun with that long iron fork, looking like a deadly weapon. Those pale gray eyes locked on him wide for a split second before snapping back to pure, guarded, frontier hostility. That old stove damper was rusted wide open. She fired right back, turning her focus to the sizzling iron pan. It drafts like a wind tunnel. I'm doing my best with a busted stove that belongs in a scrapyard. Jed stepped up his heavy boots, making those cabin floorboards groan. He sure didn't ask permission. Reaching right over her shoulder, his big, calloused hand dwarfing hers, he slammed the heel of his palm hard against the lever on that rusty stovepipe. With a harsh, screeching grind of old metal, the damper finally slammed shut. That roaring fire instantly settled into a low, steady hum. But he didn't back away just yet. He stood close enough to feel the heat baking off her skin. Close enough to catch the scent of that bitter lye soap scrubbed on her neck. It made every hair on his arm stand at attention. She didn't give an inch. She held perfectly still, her spine stiff as a rifle barrel, refusing to cower down. "Breakfast is on the table," she said, her voice pulled tight. Jed grunted, finally backing off. That sudden loss of her body heat left the mountain man feeling mighty unbalanced. He sat at that scrubbed raw wooden table and stared down at his tin plate. Biscuits burned black on the bottom, but light and flaky on top. Brittle fried salt pork and black coffee brewed thick enough to float a cast-iron horseshoe. He ate with the grim, fast efficiency of a lone rider used to chewing on half-frozen grub. Chewing loud, he stared hard at the scarred table planks. He could feel her dark eyes watching him from the hearth. Listen, friends, that made his skin crawl. A solitary wolf suddenly locked up with a sharp-eyed hawk. "I need water," she announced, shattering that heavy, quiet, pioneer cabin silence. "Bucket's dry. Gotta boil your filthy clothes." Jed slowly swallowed a dry lump of biscuit. "Creek is out back 30 yards past the trees. You'll need the heavy axe for the ice." He figured she'd beg him to do it. Chopping ice is brutal, back-breaking dawn work. Instead, Adeline just wiped her tough hands on her apron, grabbed the wooden bucket and that heavy iron axe by the door, and marched right out into the bitter winter cold without a single word. Jed sat all alone in the quiet shack. He poured himself another hot cup of chicory. He told himself to let her be. She had to learn the brutal, frozen reality of this mountain. He paid for a mail-order wife to work, not to be coddled. 5 minutes ticked by. Then 10. He cursed out loud, slamming that tin cup violently onto the wood. Black coffee splashed the rim, staining the fresh, scrubbed boards. He snatched his heavy canvas winter coat and shoved open the cabin door. The raw cold hit him like a bare-knuckle punch, stealing the very breath from his lungs. That overnight snow had turned to a rock-hard crust. He tracked her small boot prints straight toward the creek. He found her standing right at the edge of the frozen bank. She was kneeling down, hacking furiously at the thick ice with that heavy axe. The iron tool was just too long and heavy for her. Her swings were wild and ragged, driven by pure, desperate frustration instead of technique. The dull blade just bounced off the ice, sending violent, bone-rattling shocks all the way up into her thin shoulders. "Give me the damn axe!" Jed barked, sliding his boots down the snowy riverbank. Adeline spun around, chest heaving hard. Her face was flushed dark red from the strain, and her nose looked raw from the biting wind. "I can do it," she panted out, lifting that heavy iron head again. "You're gonna snap your wrists or bury that steel blade straight into your knee," Jed snarled, closing the gap in one stride. He grabbed the wood handle right above her grip. For a tense second, they actually wrestled for it. Her fingers locked onto that ashwood knuckles, pure white, stubbornly refusing to yield. He looked down at her face. Those eyes were furious, swimming with unshed, bitter tears of pure anger and humiliation. You see, she hated failing, hated needing him. "Let it go, Adeline," he told her, his deep voice dropping down, losing its rough bark. Slowly, her frozen fingers uncurled. She stumbled backward a step, hugging her arms around that thin coat, shivering violently as the cold sweat began to freeze right on her skin. Now picture this. Jed just turned his back, planted his boots wide, and swung that axe in a smooth, bone-shattering arc. That ice busted open, sounding like a rifle shot tossing dark, freezing creek water up over the frost. He plunged a wooden bucket straight in, letting that bitter cold soak right through his leather gloves. When he hauled that heavy pail out, he sure didn't hand it over. He toted it left-handed, gripping the axe right, and trudged up the steep bank. "You walk behind me," he barked without turning around. "Step right in my tracks. This crust is mighty thin over the mud." He heard her boots crunching dead in his tracks. But he didn't feel a lick of pride. Hauling that sloshing water back to his survival cabin, Jed felt a heavy, sinking dread pooling in his gut. He wanted a tough machine, but that woman trailing him was bleeding, freezing, and still fighting back. Worse yet, he was starting to care. Come mid-afternoon, the winter sky bruised up a real ugly purple. That frontier wind, which had been whistling steady all morning long, turned into a hollow roar that shook the heavy cabin timbers right to the bone. Jed sat by the hearth, carefully oiling the steel traps he aimed to set along the north ridge once the storm broke. The sharp tang of gun oil and rust filled his corner. Usually that scent gave a man some comfort. You and I know that today it was just a distraction. Adeline hadn't stopped pacing since that creek mess. She had boiled the water, scrubbed those floorboards with rough sand and lye until her knuckles bled bare, and washed his spare shirts, stringing them mighty close to that hot iron stove. Right now she was waging war on wild roots from his cellar, just hacking away with a dull, worthless kitchen knife. Jed just watched from under his hat brim. He saw how she favored her left shoulder, still sore as hell from hauling that heavy axe. He noticed how she'd pause, pressing the heel of her trembling hand against her aching lower back, her face twisting in a quick, private grimace before she forced her spine bolt straight. She was purely exhausting to watch. Her sheer, stubborn grit was like a loud shout in a silent room. "You're gonna strip the meat clean off those roots hacking like that," Jed observed right out loud, wiping grease off a steel jaw. Adeline didn't even blink. "If you sharpened your blades, I wouldn't be wrestling these vegetables to the death." Jed's jaw clamped shut. He dropped the heavy trap with a loud clatter. He stood up, drawing his hunting knife from the hip sheath. 8 inches of carbon steel honed right down to a terrifying razor edge. He strode over to that table and slammed the long blade point first right into the timber. It stuck there, quivering a bit. "Use that," he muttered. Adeline just stared at the massive weapon buried in her makeshift board. She shot Jed a look, gray eyes flat and mighty unamused. "I'm making a stew, Jed, not skinning a grizzly bear. It's sharp. Use it." He spun around and walked back to his chair, grabbing a dirty rag just to hide the strange smirk pulling at his stubborn mouth. A heavy frontier silence settled over that room, broken only by that howling wind and the slow sound of Adeline yanking the heavy hunting knife free from the tough wood. She started chopping again. The rhythm flowed smoother now, letting that heavy steel do the honest work. Then a sharp, violent hiss of breath sliced through the cabin, followed by the clatter of steel hitting those wooden floorboards. Jed snapped his head up. Adeline was clutching her left hand tight against her chest, back gone rigid. Blood was already dripping fast onto the scrubbed boards, a terrifying crimson spreading against the pale, clean wood. He didn't even think. He crossed the cabin in 3 long strides. "Show me." "It's nothing," she gasped, twisting away. "I just slipped." "Show me the damn hand, Adeline." He sure didn't wait for her permission. He snatched her wrist. Let me tell you, she fought it, but his grip was iron. He forced her palm open. The gash ran deep and ugly across her palm, right over the thumb pad. It was bleeding mighty heavy, welling up thick and fast. "Sit!" he barked, dragging her toward that hearth chair. He pushed her down hard by the tense shoulder. "I'm perfectly fine," she protested, her voice trembling slightly. "Picture this." Her face went pale as a winter moon. All that trail exhaustion finally crashing into the sharp bite of pain. "You're bleeding all over my clean floor," he grumbled, though his dry sarcasm just didn't land. He dropped to one knee, keeping a firm grip on her wrist. Snatching a clean rag from his workbench, he pressed it hard against that wound. Adeline hissed. Her eyes clamped shut, teeth biting hard into her bottom lip to stop any more sound from escaping. Jed held the pressure steady. For the very first time, he took a real look at her hands. He reckoned he'd see the soft, untouched skin of a proper city lady. Instead, her palms were a rugged map of old scars and thick, tough calluses. Sure, her fingertips had tiny white needle pricks, but there were also deep, rough patches, screaming of years of hard, back-breaking labor, hauling wet wool, scrubbing stone steps. "You lied in your letters," Jed murmured, his deep voice rolling under the howling mountain wind outside. Adeline slowly opened her eyes, staring right down at him. "About what? You claimed you were a seamstress from a quiet parlor." Jed shifted his grip to check the bleeding. It was easing up. Soft hands don't earn these calluses. Soft women don't swing an axe into solid ice until their shoulders nearly give out. Adeline stared at his dark, weathered hands gripping hers. She let out a heavy, ragged breath, the fight slowly draining right out of her bones. "I was a seamstress," she said. "After I was a laundress. After I hauled heavy coal in the rail yards at age 12. Her pale eyes met his, totally stripped of any shame. "Quiet parlor women don't sell themselves to mountain men for $50, Jed. Desperate ones do." That raw honesty struck him right in the chest, heavy and deeply unsettling. He looked back at her busted palm. Reaching into his pocket with his free hand, he pulled out a small tin of yarrow salve kept for minor trail scrapes. "Just hold still," he murmured, dabbing that green ointment onto the gash. As he worked, his rough thumb brushed the inside of her wrist. He felt her pulse there, fluttering wildly, and terrified, just like a snared jackrabbit. It was a harsh reminder of how small she was, how entirely at his mercy she found herself, up in this freezing mountain dark. He felt a sudden, terrifying rush of fierce protectiveness, a feeling he hadn't known since his hound dog died 5 years back. He hated it instantly. He bound her hand tight with a strip of clean linen, tying off the knot with quick, brutal wilderness efficiency. He dropped her wrist and stood tall, putting some solid physical distance between them. "Keep it dry," he ordered, walking back toward his traps. "I will finish the vegetables." Adeline just stayed in that chair, cradling her bandaged hand against her chest. She watched his broad shoulders as he scooped up that bloody hunting knife, wiped it clean on his trousers, and started chopping the remaining roots. "Thank you," she said softly to the silent cabin. Jed never turned around. The grip on his blade was so tight his knuckles went pure white. "Don't thank me." He grumbled those words way rougher than he actually intended. "If that hand gets infected, I don't have a cook out here." It was the exact same weak excuse he'd used back in the wagon. Now, you and I both know as the wind slammed those heavy cabin logs, that excuse sounded mighty hollow. They both felt it. That blizzard struck the ridge 2 hours past sundown. It didn't sneak in with a gentle, slow dusting of snow. No, it slammed into that cabin like a runaway freight train. Those thick log walls groaned under the sudden violent impact. The wind shrieked down the stone chimney, blasting a cloud of gray ash across her freshly scrubbed floorboards. Inside, the temperature just nosedived. The cabin's edges surrendered to the bitter freeze, leaving just a 10-foot circle around the blazing hearth where the air was even remotely livable. That tiny frontier cabin instantly felt like an iron cage. Jed sat in his chair, a newly oiled animal trap resting idle right across his thighs. He stared into the fire, but his mind was totally consumed by the tough woman sitting across from him. Adeline was mending clothes, or, well, trying to. She had a heavy canvas grain sack draped over her knees, fighting to stitch a tear using a thick iron needle. But she only had one good hand left. The other, wrapped tight in Jed's rough linen bandage, just rested awkwardly in her lap. "Let's step into this frontier cabin." She had that stiff canvas pinned between her knees, driving the needle home, then clumsily pulling the heavy thread tight with her teeth and the very edge of her wrapped-up, busted fingers. It was pure agony to witness. About every third stitch, she'd bite down on her lip, shoulders locking up as that raw palm gash screamed out. "Put it down." Jed ordered, his deep voice carrying loud right through the hollow howling of that mountain wind. Little Adeline never even looked up. She just bit the thread, yanking it tight with a stubborn jerk of her head. It needs doing. You use this heavy sack for the mule's oats. It's leaking. Those mules aren't eating from it tonight. Put it down. If I don't finish it right now, it won't be ready when the blizzard finally hits. She jammed that sharp needle back into the thick canvas. Her grip slipped. The blunt eye of that needle dug hard right into her wrapped thumb. She dropped the heavy sack with a sharp gasp, pulling that hurt hand tight against her ribs. She curled inward like a frightened animal, chin resting on her chest. She didn't make one peep, but Jed caught the quick, shallow heaving up and down of her tired shoulders. Jed set his iron trap down. He stood tall, covering the short space between them in 2 long strides. He didn't bother asking permission. He just reached right down, grabbed the rough canvas grain sack, pulled it straight off her lap, and tossed it onto the wooden table. "I told you to put it down," he growled, his tone shifting into a low, dangerous rumble. Little Adeline finally raised her eyes. Her pale gray eyes were wild and completely feral. That wasn't a woman fearing a rancher's rage. It was the pure panic of a trapped beast, terrified of what happens out west when you outlive your usefulness. "I can still work," she swore, her voice trembling with a fierce heat that took him completely by surprise. "It's just a cut. I've survived much worse. I hauled wet laundry in dead winter with busted ribs. I can sew a damn sack." Old Jed just stared down at her. "Stick with me here." His anger drained away, replaced by cold clarity. He finally understood. The girl wasn't just acting stubborn. She was surviving. In her brutal world, broken tools were simply thrown away. A hired hand who couldn't pull their own weight got tossed right into the snowy street. She looked at Jed and saw a boss judging a busted, worthless investment. She honestly believed he would throw her to the howling blizzard if she couldn't prove her worth. That heavy realization made the man physically sick. Jed dragged over a 3-legged milking stool and sat down hard, right in front of her, their knees nearly brushing. He leaned himself forward, resting his tired elbows on his thighs. He made her meet his eyes, keeping his weathered face completely neutral. "Look around, Adeline," he spoke quietly. She blinked, her brow tying up tight. She didn't move her head. "Look at this cabin," he insisted, sweeping his big hand outward toward the dark, dusty corners of the cabin. "Now look at me. Do I resemble some roofless rail yard boss? Do I look like a greedy St. Louis parlor madam?" She studied his rough face, that jagged scar cutting through his left eyebrow, and those deep, lonely lines framing his mouth. "No," she whispered out. "I bought a wife. I didn't buy a work mule." That word felt mighty strange in his mouth, heavy and permanent. "You busted your hand open trying to do my chores with my dull tools. That blame falls squarely on me. You won't starve just because you can't stitch a feed sack for 3 days. You aren't going back down this mountain. Our transaction is completely over." Little Adeline just stared, searching his steady eyes for any lie. She kept hunting for the trick, the hidden Western cost. Finding absolutely none, that stiff panic keeping her spine bolt upright just suddenly broke apart. She melted back into that wooden chair, letting out a long, ragged, shaky breath. Her eyes drifted shut, the hearth fire catching the damp tears on her pale face. "That stew is burning up," she mumbled, her weary voice thick. "I'll stir it," Jed replied. He stood up tall. He strolled to the cast-iron stove, grabbed a long wooden spoon, and started scraping the bottom of his heavy Dutch oven. The rich smell of wild onions and venison rose in a thick, hearty cloud. He listened to the fierce mountain wind clawing at his roof. He heard the quiet, bone-tired sound of Adeline breathing softly behind him. He had spent 7 hard years harvesting silence, building a massive wall of mountain ice and stone to block the world out. You and I know what happened next. Ladling stew into 2 tin bowls, he realized that ice wall was already gone. Listen closely. Jed was dead sick of the quiet. He craved the grit, blood, and frontier brawl. Come sunrise on that third morning, the howling gale quit. That dead quiet hit like an anvil, making a man's ears ring. Jed put his boot right through that heavy oak door, took 3 mean heaves of his shoulder just to bust through the snowdrift packed hard against the timber. Morning glare smacked him like a fist, bright and untouched. The whole frontier was wiped clean. Them ragged pines sat buried beneath heavy, choking heaps of snow, and that winter air was so bitter, it scorched his throat like cheap, raw whiskey. He snatched his snowshoes off the iron peg right nearby. "Stay put," he hollered back into the cabin. "Keep those embers hot. I'm checking the livestock." Adeline stood by the iron stove, cradling some dark coffee. She was looking a fair bit better. A couple days of mandated rest put a touch of life back in her face, though she kept that wrapped hand tucked away. The woman did not fuss, just offered a quick nod. Jed laced up them shoes and started his grueling march toward the animal shed. That powder was mighty deep, fighting him the whole way. But that morning quiet got shattered fast by one wicked, terrifying racket. A nasty, splitting crack rang out like rifle fire across the gorge. Jed cursed to high heaven. He pushed harder, legs screaming as he topped the drift, hiding the shelter. The old lean-to was caving. 3 feet of soggy snow piled on that pitched roof was just too much for the weathered wood. A primary support beam, a stout pine trunk, bowed way inward, showing a nasty, ragged split right down its middle. Inside the shed, those mules were kicking wild. The stink of their terror, sour ammonia and sweat sliced right through the frost. If that roof gave out, they'd be flattened right then. Now, you and I know, without mules, you ain't hauling timber or furs. Without them beasts, they were stuck till the spring thaw. "Hold steady," Jed roared, sliding right into the shadowy stall. He snatched a spare, rough-barked log he kept piled in the corner for kindling. It ran 8 feet long and thicker than a man's thigh. He jammed one end into the frozen dirt, throwing all his frontier muscle against it, trying to force the top under that buckling beam to brace the roof. Too much weight. The angle fought him. His boots kept slipping on the slick, frozen muck covering the ground. He thrust upward, a feral grunt of pure effort ripping from his lungs. That main rafter let out another miserable holler, drooping an inch lower. Sawdust showered right down onto his heavy shoulders. He needed better leverage and extra hands, but he was dead alone. Then a sudden shadow cut the glaring doorway. Jed cranked his neck, teeth flashing in a desperate scowl. Miss Adeline was standing right there, no snowshoes on her feet. She stood knee-deep in the drift, drowning in his big canvas duster, copper hair blowing wild around her face. "Get out!" Jed bellowed. "This whole thing is coming down." She didn't panic or holler. She sized up that caving roof, the sliding post, and Jed's desperate stance in 2 flat seconds. She waded right into the shack, fresh snow shedding off her boots. "The bottom's giving out!" she hollered over the braying mules. "You heave up! I will kick the base in!" "Your hand." "Forget my damn hand, Jed. Push!" The man just didn't have the wind to argue back. That heavy timber popped again. He drove his boots into the icy earth, locked his joints, and heaved up with every ounce of soul. His back muscles caught fire, feeling like meat ripping straight off the bone. Adeline hit her knees right in the muck. She jammed her shoulder against the base of that massive bracing log, gripping that frosty bark tight with her one good hand. She drove her thick leather boot hard into the timber's base. "Again!" she screamed, her voice tearing. Jed shoved hard. Adeline kicked again. The log moved an inch. "Again!" Jed loosed a wild, primitive roar of pure grit, slamming his shoulder into that timber. Miss Adeline stomped her boot into the base one last time. That log snapped into place, wedging tight between the permafrost and the sagging roof. The awful groaning finally quit. The roof held firm. Jed stumbled backward, sucking in air. We've all felt that bone-deep exhaustion, lungs blazing from frost and sheer willpower. Now listen close. Jed leaned against that rough timber wall, wiping sweat from his brow with a shaking, leather-clad hand. Adeline hadn't moved from the dirt floor. She just sat there in the freezing dust, knees pulled tight, gasping for air. Her hat was long gone, leaving her covered head to toe in sawdust and mule hair. She stared at her bandaged hand. That white linen was soaking through with fresh, bright blood. The wound had torn right open. Jed's heart hammered against his ribs. He crossed that tight space and dropped to one knee right beside her. He did not ask if she was fine. He offered no sweet, empty words of comfort. He just reached out, gently gripping her wrist, to study the blood seeping through that cloth. He looked up from her torn hand to her face. She was worn down, filthy, and absolutely magnificent. "You are an idiot." He breathed, his voice sounding rough. A slow, bone-tired smirk pulled at Adeline's pale lips. "I saved your roof, mountain man. You are mighty welcome." Jed just stared. That cold, hardened shell he had worn for 7 long years finally cracked down the middle, just like that busted pine beam above them. He realized he had not just taken in a survivor. He had bargained for a true partner. Letting her wrist drop, he slid his heavy, calloused hand around the back of her neck, pulling her close. Slowly, he rested his forehead right against hers. He did not kiss her. This was no time for romance. It was just a raw, honest connection made in the freezing dark. "Yeah," he whispered against her cold skin. "I reckon you did." Now, folks, that burning adrenaline from the freezing lean-to, it vanished the second those two crossed the threshold of the main cabin. It left behind a downright brutal, bone-deep exhaustion. It made Jed's rugged hands shake as he shoved the heavy door shut against the howling snow. Adeline did not walk toward the fire. She just stood dead center in the room, melted snow pooling around her leather boots, staring blankly at the rusted stove. Her teeth chattered so hard you could hear the sharp clack of enamel. She was completely drained, her body finally surrendering to the winter shock, the brutal pioneer exertion, and the torn flesh of her hand. Jed stripped off his thick work gloves with his teeth and tossed them onto the table. "Get that coat off," he ordered, his voice missing its usual frontier thunder. He sounded mighty ragged. She fumbled with the heavy horn buttons on his canvas coat, but her frozen fingers simply refused to cooperate. Her good hand was shaking hard while the other dripped fresh red blood right onto the wooden floorboards. She let out a pitiful, frustrated groan. A trapped noise caught in her throat. Jed stepped right into her space, gently batting her trembling hands away. He did not ask permission. He just unbuttoned that stiff canvas and peeled it off her shoulders. The thick wool dress beneath was soaked with snow and sweat. He could feel those violent tremors racking her weary spine. "Sit down," he muttered softly, pushing her gently by the shoulder toward the thick pallet of bearskins resting near the hearth. Adeline collapsed onto those heavy furs, curling her knees tight against her chest. She wrapped an arm around her ribs, shivering, wild and out of control. Jed kept moving. He tossed 3 massive timber logs onto the dying embers, pumping the leather bellows until fire roared up the chimney, casting frantic, jumping shadows across the cabin walls. He grabbed his old iron kettle, filled it full from the water bucket, and slammed it down onto the stove. Only then did he kneel right beside her. "Let me see it," he demanded, reaching out for her injured hand. Adeline flinched hard, pulling it much tighter against her chest. "It is just bleeding. It will stop." "It is full of dirt and sawdust, Adeline. Hand it over." He did not wait for her to give in. Gripping her wrist, he unwrapped that blood-soaked linen as she hissed in sharp pain. That bad cut had torn open wider than before, the flesh looking raw and angry. But it was not just the blood worrying him now. Her pale skin felt entirely wrong. Her fingers were cold as winter ice, yet her palm radiated a sickly, dry heat. He studied her tired face. Her pale gray eyes were glassy and unfocused, staring right at the color of his shirt instead of meeting his face. A harsh, unnatural red flush stained her high cheekbones, looking mighty stark against the waxy, sickly white of her skin. The bitter cold had not just settled into her bones. It had invited a dangerous fever. You know how deadly a frontier fever gets. Jed swore viciously, stood up, grabbed a clean basin and poured in some raw whiskey from A. He hauled a hidden jug from under his bunk, mixing it with scalding kettle water. He chucked in some dried yarrow. Right away, that cabin reeked of harsh liquor and bitter frontier weeds. Kneeling back in the dirt, he soaked a clean cloth in the blistering brew. "This will burn," he warned her straight. He didn't sugarcoat a damn thing, and he sure didn't dawdle. He scrubbed that raw flesh hard, washing out every speck of trail grime. Adeline held her tongue, but her whole body bowed off those bear hides. She locked her jaw so fierce he swore a tooth shattered. A deep, ragged groan ripping loose from her throat. Her right hand whipped out, seizing his forearm. Those fingernails bit into his flesh with wild strength, battling that fierce agony. Jed held his grip steady, ignoring her claws. His rugged face locked into a cold stone mask. But deep down, a jagged spike of fear pierced his gut. Out in this wild country, a fever meant certain death. Infection was the grim reaper itself. He bound up her hand tight with fresh cotton. He dragged a heavy wool blanket right off his own cot, tossing it over her violently shaking frame. Come sundown, the fierce shaking quit giving way to a dangerous burning fever. Adeline laid flat out on those bearskins, rolling her head weakly back and forth. That cabin was roasting, the hearth blazing so hot it nearly split the chimney rock. But she kept crying about the bitter cold. Jed parked on a three-legged stool beside her, completely forsaking his traps, his pelts, and his daily mountain chores. He gripped a wet rag, clearing the clammy sweat off her brow and the delicate hollow of her throat. Her clean lye soap scent vanished, swallowed by the foul, rusty stink of bad fever. Then she started rambling out loud. Her words came out broken, pulled straight from the darkest, roughest shadows of her past. "Please don't dock my wages." She rasped, her voice dry as dust. "I caught the thread. I caught it, Mr. Higgins! I caught it!" Jed dunked the cloth in cold water, wringing it dry. "Quiet down now, Adeline," he murmured gently, laying a wet rag over her eyes. She heard nothing. Her healthy hand snatched up bunches of wool, wringing it without mercy. "That coal is too heavy. The pail keeps dragging. Just tell them I can pull it." A single tear slipped from her eye, cutting a clean trail through the soot on her cheek. "I ain't worthless. Don't dump me in that alley." Those panicked pleas struck Jed like hard physical blows. Now you and I know hardship, but Jed saw the crushing weight of her whole brutal life poured into one fevered dream. That poor girl never tasted an ounce of mercy. She only understood cruel trades, bone-deep exhaustion, and sheer survival. He stretched out his giant leathered hand, completely swallowing her wildly thrashing fist. He softly pressed it down against her chest, pinning it with firm, unshakable Western strength. "You aren't in no alley," he murmured, his deep voice sinking into a rough, grounding anchor inside that silent cabin. "You're on the mountain. Ain't nobody docking your wages." He kept vigil there for 10 solid hours. He kept that hearth blazing hot. He coaxed tiny beads of water right between her parched lips. He heard the bitter wind howling against those logs, a lonely sound that served as his sole partner for 7 long years. But watching the painfully weak, labored rise and fall of that young woman's chest, Jed knew with chilling, absolute certainty that if the quiet returned tomorrow, it would destroy him. A foul stench woke her up. It was thick, harsh, and downright spoiled. Adeline finally peeled her eyes open. Those lids felt like they were scoured with river sand. The blinding morning sun was stabbing straight through the solitary, frost-covered cabin window, branding a bright white square across the rough floorboards. Her tongue tasted of old ash and bitter copper. She attempted to swallow, but her parched throat was swollen entirely shut. She shifted her weight, trying to sit up straight, and the whole darn room spun on a wicked tilt. Her limbs felt like weak creek water completely drained of grit, while a vicious, throbbing pain hammered with every heartbeat from her injured hand. She hacked out a miserable, dry cough and slumped right back onto those bearskins. "Stop moving," Now picture a gruff voice rumbling from the dark corner. Jed was parked at the timber table. He looked downright awful. His heavy hair was tangled, his jaw dark with 3 days of thick stubble, and his rugged clothes looked slept in, mostly because they surely were. That table before him was a wild clutter of battered tin cups, a half-drained jug of strong whiskey, and a pile of bloody rags. Adeline stared at the frontiersman, trying to piece her shattered memories back together. Gather round. The snow, the beam, the fire, that burning rag. "How long?" she croaked. Her voice sounded like 2 dry river rocks scraping together. Jed stood tall. His joints popped like dry twigs in that quiet cabin. 2 days, he stated flatly, ambling over to the stove. A truly unholy smell was rising up from an iron pot resting on that hot metal. He grabbed a rag, hefted the pot, and poured a thick gray sludge into a battered tin cup. He walked back over. Those heavy leather boots lacked their usual thundering stride. The man looked bone-tired. He dropped to one knee by the pallet, sliding a massive arm right beneath her shoulders. He didn't ask for permission. He just hauled her upright, bracing her fragile back against his broad chest. His body heat seeped straight through her thin dress and that heavy wool blanket. "Drink," he ordered, pressing the tin cup right to her lips. Adeline took one sip and gagged. It was a vile brew of bone broth salt and something that tasted exactly like bitter tree bark. She tried to pull away. "I said drink it," Jed repeated. His grip on her shoulder tightened, just enough to turn him into solid stone. "You sweat out half your body weight. You need the salt." She glared right at him. A flicker of her wild defiance sparked in those gray eyes, but she just didn't have the strength to fight. She choked down 3 more swallows of the foul brew, then let her head fall back against his collarbone, totally spent. She stared around that rustic cabin from her new vantage point. Absolute disaster. The wood floor she had scrubbed until her knuckles bled was covered in mud and ash. Those fresh shirts she had washed were tossed in a wrinkled pile on the chair. An unwashed skillet sat slick with cold grease on the stove. A sharp spike of pure panic hit her chest. "The chores," she whispered. Her breathing hitched, her eyes going wide. "The floor. I have to." She tried to shove out of his grip, her right hand scrambling uselessly against the heavy furs. "Sit still," Jed barked, his deep voice cracking like a bullwhip. Adeline froze, fast, her shoulders tense, waiting for a harsh reprimand, waiting to be called a burden. You and I both know she expected this deal to be canceled. Jed let out a long, heavy exhale. The anger drained right out of him, leaving behind something raw and uneasy. He gently lowered her back down to the pallet, pulling the rough blanket up to her chin. He never stood up. He just stayed on one knee, those massive hands resting easy on his thighs. "The chores are dead, Adeline," he said, his voice dropping into a quiet, terrifyingly honest tone. "The floor is dirty. Skillet too. I don't give a damn." "I have to work," she insisted, her voice trembling with a desperate edge. "You paid $50. I have to earn my keep. If I can't work, I don't—" She swallowed hard. The ghosts of the rail yards and freezing alleys were suffocating her. "I don't have anywhere else to go." Jed just stared. He reached out. His rough thumb brushed a damp strand of rust-colored hair right off her pale forehead. That gesture was shockingly gentle for a man built like a mountain. "Do you think I dragged you from that snowstorm to mop my floor?" he asked softly. Adeline blinked. The heavy exhaustion made it real hard to follow his logic. "You wanted a cook." "I wanted a ghost," Jed corrected. His dark eyes locked onto hers, completely unblinking. "I wanted someone to boil water and stay out of my way. But you didn't do that. You marched in and fought the damn ice with an axe. You kicked a support beam while a roof was falling on your head." He leaned close, smelling like wood smoke and stale coffee. "You don't owe me labor just for breathing, Adeline. The debt is paid. Paid the second you threw your shoulder under that timber to save my mules. I don't want a maid anymore. Adeline just stared at him, chest tight. That cynical armor she'd worn since she was 12 was cracking wide open under the sheer heavy weight of the man's honesty. She didn't know how to navigate this frontier. She only knew cold transactions. She only knew survival. Then what do you want? She whispered, terrified. Now what do you and I think happens next? Jed just looked at her pale face, at her jagged reality. Let me tell you about survival. He let his hand drop from her hair, resting heavy against her neck. His thumb felt that wild, bird-like flutter of her pulse. I want you to heal your damn hand, he growled, his thumb tracing her skin. Out in that bitter cold, it was a quiet promise of warmth. And then I want you teaching me how to bake a biscuit that doesn't taste like an iron wedge. That mountain didn't just hand over spring. It coughed up winter in ugly, mean fits of mud and freezing rain. The howling wind died, replaced by the steady, maddening drip of water rolling off the cabin eaves. Inside, the heavy air hung thick with the frontier scent of wet wool, melting snow, and rising yeast. 6 long weeks since that frontier fever broke. Jed sat at the scarred timber table, a heavy leather awl gripped tight. He was driving fresh holes straight into Jasper's working harness. That stiff leather carried the sharp tang of neatsfoot oil and hard sweat. With a grunt, he forced the iron spike through the thick hide, twisting hard. Across the room, Adeline was working the dough. He quit working, letting the heavy rig hit his lap. He just watched her. She had finally ditched that tight pioneer woman knot. Now her rust-red hair fell in a heavy braid, the frayed tail brushing her waist with every fierce shove of her palms into the flour. She wore one of his big, beat-up flannel shirts with those sleeves rolled way up past her elbows. She clearly favored her left hand. The old bandages were gone, leaving behind a thick, angry pink scar cutting clean across her palm. It pulled tight when she stretched her fingers. It was a permanent, puckered map of that brutal mountain violence, but she sure didn't stop using it. She threw her weight into that dough pressing and punishing the flour until it finally gave up into a smooth, elastic ball. She slammed it into a greased iron bowl, wiping away a smear of white dust from her forehead with her wrist. She turned around and caught him staring hard. She didn't flinch or look away. The pale, dusty gray of her eyes had gone dark this past month. All that old feral panic got replaced by something rock-steady and unnervingly direct. You'll snap that awl if you keep gripping it like a murder weapon, she told him. Her tone kept that dry, raspy desert edge, but it sure wasn't a shield to hide behind anymore. It was simply her. Jed glanced down. He was clutching that wooden handle so damn hard his knuckles shone bone white. He dropped the tool with a dull clatter. He stood his chair scraping rough and loud against the warped cabin floorboards. He crossed the cramped wooden room. That old battlefield space between them suddenly felt dangerously tight. He stopped dead in front of her, the iron stove's heat wrapped around them both. "Give me the hand," he murmured. Adeline's jaw locked for just a split second, a real ghost of those old survival instincts, but she never argued. She lifted her left hand, dusted fine with white flour, and laid it palm up in his massive, calloused Western grip. Jed completely ignored her face. He just studied that scar. He traced the jagged pink ridge with his thumb, slowly wiping away the flour. His touch ran painstakingly slow, a heavy, rough friction against her tender skin. "Does it pull?" he asked, his voice a deep rumble in his chest. "Only when the weather turns cold," she answered. Her breath hitched just a bit, a raw reaction to the heat of his rough thumb dragging across those damaged nerves. "It's ugly." He stated the cold, hard frontier truth. "I've got a dozen uglier," she fired back, chin high. "I told you, I'm no parlor ornament, Jed. I'm built for the dirt." Jed finally looked up from her marked palm, meeting her gaze. "Stick with me here." That cynical armor he wore for 7 long years was gone, stripped raw by the ice and the fever. He didn't see some helpless maid, nor a simple transaction. He saw the only soul that ever planted its boots in his frozen western wasteland, and flat out refused to die. "I know what you're built for," he breathed. He never dropped her hand. Instead, he used it to jerk her right forward. That kiss wasn't gentle, and it sure wasn't romance. It was a downright wild collision. Jed's mouth crashed down on hers, starving and desperate, backing her right into the edge of that heavy timber counter. His massive hands let go of her scarred palm, grabbing her waist to haul her flush against his chest. That sudden impact rattled every tin cup sitting up on the shelf. Adeline gasped against his lips, a sharp sound of pure shock that instantly gave way to wild, roaring surrender. But she didn't just melt. No, she fought right back. Her hands tangled deep in his wild, overgrown hair, short nails scraping his scalp. She tasted of black coffee and bitter salt. Now him, he tasted like worn leather and the biting sting of winter air. It was real clumsy, mighty rough. Their teeth clashed together as they hastily shifted angles, both of them moving with the frantic urgency of poor folks who had been freezing their whole lives and finally stumbled upon a blazing fire. Jed blindly shoved a heavy iron skillet out of the way with his elbow. The iron shrieked against the raw wood as he pulled her closer. He buried his rugged face right in her neck, breathing in the scent of lye soap and the warm, living heat of her skin. He let out a harsh, ragged breath that sounded a lot like a groan. "You're staying," he muttered against her collarbone, his voice thick and demanding.
"Friend, it sure wasn't no question."
Adeline wrapped her arms tight around his broad shoulders, pressing her scarred hand deep into the heavy muscles of his back. She could feel the violent, erratic pounding of his wild heart against her ribs. She closed her eyes, letting the lingering ghosts of those freezing St. Louis rail yards and bitter alleys burn away into ash. "I'm staying," she whispered fiercely. "Try to throw me out, you rugged mountain man. See what happens." Jed pulled back just barely enough to look at her, a slow, genuine grin, a rare, startling look that completely softened the harsh, weathered landscape of his face, broke through his thick beard. He leaned his forehead against hers, the chaotic rhythm of their harsh breathing filling that tiny cabin. Out there, the winter ice was cracking, giving way to the mud and the towering pines. But inside, standing there amidst the flour, the leather, and the heavy iron, Old Man Winter was permanently dead. The rugged mountain had finally been claimed. And folks, that brings our untamed journey to an end. If Jed and Adeline's fierce, hard-fought frontier romance got your blood pumping, do not ride off without hitting that like button. Tell me down in the comments what your favorite part was. Did you love that raw tension, or the explosive, deeply earned payoff? Share this tale with fellow fans of truly gritty, emotional Western storytelling. Make sure to subscribe to the channel and ring that bell. We've got plenty more incredible, grounded Western stories waiting for you. Thanks kindly for gathering around the fire, and I'll see you on the next wild adventure.